Najskôr sa venujeme kategórii development. Možno viete, ak ste si už pozreli na DAAD.sk podrobný obsah. Ideme sa pozrieť na to, ako sa majú v CRESCu. Dovolte mi najbližších 15 minút venovať architektovi Vasovi Perovičovi. Ten je pôvodom z Belehradu. Spolu založil renomovaný slovinský architektonický ateliér Bevk Perovic architekti. Vasa Perovič je niekoľkonásobným nositeľom plečníkovej ceny za architektúru a prednáša na vysokých školách po celej Európe. V jeho príspevku sa budeme venovať tomu, ako sa tvoria verejné funkcie v mestách v dobe individualizmu s najlepšími ukážkami zo zahraničia aj zo Slovenska. Bude to mimoriadne zaujímavé. Práve na Slovensku ateliér Bevk Perovic architekti vyhral architektonickú súťaž, ktorú vyhlásil najväčší rezidenčný developer na Slovensku, spoločnosť CRESCO Real Estate. Spolu s CRESCom sa teda bude Vasa Perovič podieľať na dizajne a urbanizme časti rezidenčnej štvrte Slnečnice, ktorá vyrastá v Bratislave na juhu Petržalky. No je to najpovolanejší človek, s ktorým sa porozprávať o tomto projekte. Svojím rozsahom je to najväčší rezidenčný projekt na Slovensku. Tak poďte si vypočuť rozprávanie, s ktorým prichádza do nášho programu Vasa Perovič.
Good afternoon, everybody. My name is Vasa Perovic, and I'm, of course, speaking as practically everybody, I think, today offline. I come from the office of Bevk Perovic, but today I'm using a kind of a commercial break of CRESCO group to maybe give you a kind of a very short presentation or a very short lecture. This is not a lecture really about our office, but more a lecture of the projects. So I'm going to include some projects, but more a lecture of a possible case for public space. This is something I spoke to people in Bratislava already once last year about the idea of constructing public spaces today at this age of individuality, or a kind of a construction of public space in this kind of private time. With the lack of public interest and especially lack of public funding, how is it possible for cities today to gain public amenities, improve and construct public spaces? What are the possible ways for poor cities to gain the public spaces through careful management of private funding? I want to put a case for public space forward, show the importance of considering it in different ways and different means in every project, regardless of really who the real client is. I will also point to a few historical situations to illustrate the radical changes in possibilities for establishment of public space in the last few centuries. When we say city, we automatically assume a place with a lot of buildings and a lot of people, a lot of density and organic material, which is us, more or less, construction materials, which is buildings, and tend to forget that there is the emptiness in between that is also the constituent element of our environment. That is basically the constituent element of our environment, which is basically public space. If our cities would not have public space, and if they would be not connected in between themselves and had no relation, they would look more like this diagram on the right-hand side, where you see a contemporary metropolis split into constituent parts, buildings and city blocks. Public space is not only the open space in between the buildings. The publicly accessible spaces of the buildings are also public space. So in this case, you see the famous Noli Plan of Rome from 1748, which basically this gray mass that you see are more or less the housing programs of the city, and all of the publicly accessible interior spaces are also included. Those interior spaces can be as fantastic as this one. The oculus of the Pantheon is a kind of a sun over a public square surrounded by city-looking facades. Or we have other examples. We have this radical example of Osman in 1853 to 1870, the reconstruction of Paris, where he basically, with the kind of power of state behind him, Osman basically constructs the Paris as we know it today. Here you see L'Étoile from basically with some remaining structures, medieval structures in between. But this kind of gestures are practically unimaginable today, because basically there is no state interest and there is very little city interest in this. In Vienna in 1857, Emperor Franz Joseph of Austria issues the decree, the famous decree Es ist mein Wille, where basically he decides, or he single-handedly decides to transform all the defensive ring around Vienna into what we know today as Viennese ring, or of museums, palaces, parks, and boulevards, the transforming gesture that makes the city of Vienna that we know today. And in this ring, planned by Camilo Zites. Again, I'm stressing the importance of the state decision in this case. The Ringstrasse is a glue between the center and the surroundings of the city. This becomes a kind of a continuous center of the city, and the state is still in charge of the public domain. And that state is so powerful that in the front you see the Naturhistorisches Museum and Kunsthistorisches Museum, the two museums which are built at around that time, with a kind of a huge park in between, where these public amenities are still possible. It is still possible to build these public amenities. In the background you see the 1990s public amenities, which are the Museum of Contemporary Art, the Leopold Museum, and the Architekturzentrum Vienna. And basically you see that they are actually built in the interior courtyard. So it is no longer, even with the rich state of today, possible to do these vast gestures anymore. Another vast gesture in exactly the same years, in 1857, 1858, Manhattan and Central Park, a capitalist metropolis in the making with a central green space, a simulacrum of nature surrounded by the city. It is a compensation for superdensity surrounding the Central Park today, but also a price enhancer for the plots of the land surrounding it. Between 1821 and 1855, the New York City nearly quadrupled in population. Therefore, this piece of nature is a possible relief. Even today, if you look at the city as dense as it is today, it is still the piece of nature captured by civilization. Today, these efforts seem heroic and are, due to the poorness of our cities and even states, or lack of interest of cities and states, utterly unattainable. Exactly 1 century after Central Park, in 1958, exactly 100 years, a small setback on a park avenue makes a revolution. A public space in front of a company headquarters, in this case Seagram building, is a public space made with private capital belonging to the city. So in that sense, it is the first time that it is one of the rare occasions in which a private capital creates a space and basically gives it back to the city. A gift to the city is a simultaneous gift to the building itself, of course, setting it back from the street, but the message is clear. A piece of architecture is responsible for public domain as well. Otherwise, we will end up with this, so that our cities don't resemble simple typological archives of built form. The last time my own current city, where I live, Ljubljana, undertook a fundamental improvement or change in public space was in 1920s, 30s, with the re-emergence of the city center according to the projects, a series of projects of Jože Plečnik. The center of which is the famous 3 bridges, which became the central somehow point of the city, public space as a glue for the city. And along immediately next to this bridge, it's flanked by the market, a kind of a stoa, a kind of a version of a stoa from the antique, promenade along the river containing shops for the market. And a kind of a continuous, let's say, line of protection from rain and protection from elements as you stroll from your own house towards the city market. Anyway, the cities of today are poor. They have no means to execute and maintain the public spaces on the level that it was possible, say, only 50 years ago. What could be the way out of this today? Should the spaces be left at the will of developers, occasional patronage, or should they be conceived with the concept of common goal regulated by the city? And what should the architects do about this? What could be their role? It is our understanding that as architects, we are always responsible for this. And very often the public space in the city, this is one of our first projects, is the only unregulated space. So in this case, we were designing on the left-hand side an urban plan, on the right-hand side our resolution of the urban plan, social housing that is owned by the city. But at some point we realized that basically the public space in the center is the only one which is totally unregulated. Therefore, our project not only focuses on the architecture, but in fact on this public space in between all the buildings, because it becomes an extension of the very small units and very small apartments these people will have. So this public space is basically the large living room for the entire neighborhood, not only for these 6 blocks, but also for the blocks that surround it, and therefore becomes the focus of the entire project. In this same area, we at some point over the course of 15 years of our practice built another 2 neighborhoods, all of them commissioned as social housing owned by the city. And the last one, which was finished 2 years ago, has similar, let's say, intentions. The idea of basically very dense housing settlements and the kind of the surrounding space which should have some sort of a public use and public accessibility, which should become literally the part of the city that you could inhabit very easily, and that should give a kind of a quality to the public life of the part of the city. We do a similar thing in a project in Antwerp, which is currently under construction. Actually, it's currently finished, where on a very, very busy Noorderlands, so-called boulevard that connects the city of Antwerp to the port, we reconstruct the entire city block. And this reconstruction basically lets us open up the interior of the city block and create a kind of a park, a kind of a publicly accessible area, hidden from the noise of the huge boulevard next to it, and accessible to the entire neighborhood. So in a sense, through construction of social housing project, we construct also a publicly accessible area for the entire city. We are doing a similar thing in Bratislava currently. It is a project that we are developing in Južné Mesto for CRESCO, and it is a project where also the large development of housing is counteracted by a linear promenade and park that flank it and become part of the city. Here you see the basic arrangement where we talk about these building plots as kind of the idea of islands of density, flanked by the greenery that somehow becomes part of the project or becomes the main part of the project in our case. The urban plan, one of the phases of the urban plan, it's already a little bit changed, but what has not changed is the idea of this kind of very strong public promenade that connects all of these 5 or 6 islands, and the linear park, and the linear park that basically becomes all the amenity of the housing project, but also the amenity of the entire new growing neighborhood. So that in a sense, in a 10 years time, we are hoping that the relevance of the surrounding buildings is going to be inferior, except that of course the developer is going to make money, who is accidentally inviting us also to give this talk, but it will be kind of a very livable part of the city. In our public projects, we do very similar, we try very similar things. These are the 3 projects that I'm just going to very quickly show. And the first one being the National Library of Slovenia, from the point of view, of course, all of them from point of view of the public space. National Library of Slovenia, which is the extension of the famous National Library of Jože Plečnik. It's actually 100 meters from it. On the right-hand side, you see Plečnik's library. On the left-hand side, the Roman excavations that somehow give determine the geometry of our project that comes on top. You can see the relation between the old library, which has this magnificent reading room in the middle, and then the Roman ruins on which we are constructing. And the Roman ruins somehow are the first defining point of our project. The second defining point of our projects are the 2 squares, which currently with the construction of the building we create for the city. We deliberately decide not to finish the city block, which was expected by the competition, but to create an entity which will allow for 2 squares that bring visitors to the library to become part of the city. The library then raises on top with this kind of central reading space of the new library, parallel to the central reading space of famous Plečnik's library. The entrance square, which brings all the visitors into the Roman city, which becomes the main hall of the library. So we actually insert all the public programs of the library via these 2 big public squares, into the Roman excavations of the old Roman city of Emona. And then the huge new reading room, a series of platforms that basically sits on top of Cardo, one of the Roman streets, and is in fact the big public amenity, a kind of a vertical public space which raises up from the ground, from the Roman excavations, semi-underground Roman excavations, up into the air. In another project that we are currently doing for the city of Ljubljana, and again happening in the city of Ljubljana, is the National Theatre, the reconstruction of the National Theatre, which is a very, very, I would say, rather miserable, modest 19th century building. You see it on the left-hand side at the time it was built, on the right-hand side, the way it looks today, where the project, besides being, of course, a project for reconstruction and new amenities for the old theater, becomes also the project of reconstruction of the public space. The space around the building and the pink space that you see in this diagram, which is the main foyer, which is inserted under the old building, become some sort of the extension of the city spaces. We clean up the entire area. That area is quite visible on the upper part of this image. And if you walk along this area, you can at some point sink down into the huge hole, enter into the foyer, which is the blue space underneath the old building, in section, and in render, and exit onto the other side of the building. So this foyer becomes the kind of a part of the public space of the city. And then the third project, which is already constructed, which is already finished, is a small museum we constructed in Wiener Neustadt, which is just as you drive from Ljubljana, just before the city of Vienna, and if you drive from Bratislava, just after the city of Vienna, if you drive towards Ljubljana. It's a corner of the old medieval structure of the old medieval fortress, and these are the storage, ammunition storage spaces, which we have been commissioned 2 years ago to clean, and we finished it actually last year. It is already open. This is the layout of the existing state of the underground storage spaces for ammunition from medieval times. We have done these two processes, which are shown here. One is the process of cleaning, and the other is the process of new additions. The process of cleaning was basically the process done with archaeologists and art historians, where we basically just cleaned the historic spaces, and we added these two black things, a welcome center and a Neue Galerie space, a multi-purpose space in the back, which somehow connects the building to the city. If I go quicker, these connections are quite obvious. From the top, you come from the city, you sink underground, and you enter into the medieval part. So this is the point where you enter into the city. The space that stays, that we clean up in front, becomes the kind of a city plaza or a city square, sloping, but also possible to organize all the Christmas markets and everything for the city. You enter through it into the concrete new constructions, and through that into the medieval constructions of the old city part, of the old underground part of the ammunition storages, which is of course used as exhibition spaces and as lobby to enter into the back space, which is the Neue Galerie space, and underground space for multi-purpose, a kind of a publicly accessible amenity for the city, which can be used for exhibitions, concerts, and it has stoplights which are sticking out into the city park. The project, the building is practically underground. This is only the upper half of the plan, and the kind of the flexibility of these spaces and the possibility to organize all kinds of different events is something that basically brings this project as a kind of a public amenity back to the city. What was I trying to tell you today is that at some point we had this kind of relation, the state and the city and the developer or the owner and the architect. Then the state fell out because the state is not interested in development of the public spaces in the cities, essentially, unless they're the main squares of the government. Then the ownership, which is too incremental today, and it is very difficult to kind of talk about the idea of the owner. So we have the city and the developer and the architect. And then the role of the city also gets diminished, because the cities today have no money. They only have the ability to basically control the laws that govern the development of land in the city, and therefore have power through legal means rather than through fiscal means. And of course, then we have the developer. And the relation between the city and the developer and the architect in creation of public space for the cities of today has to be radically restructured. Architect can be a mediator in this process. Otherwise, if we don't, we will end up with cities which look like this. Of course, it's a very charming image, but it's essentially a portion of LA which has zero public space. Or we will end up in cities and metropolises like this, which would be just a kind of archives of built forms without any connection tissues in between themselves. Thank you very much, and have a nice day.
Ďakujeme pekne aj my. Vypočuli sme si, aké plány má CRESCO. Hovoril Bevk Perovic, a teda boli to mimoriadne pútavé informácie z kategórie development, a ďakujeme v tejto chvíli CRESCu, že sa takisto ako partner podieľa na fungovaní Dní architektúry a dizajnu. Aj vďaka vám môžeme sa stretávať počas tohto týždňa s mimoriadnymi hostiami.